My name is Morgata, and I come from O in Enugu State, Nigeria. For 25 years of my life, I operated fully inside what we call the kingdom of darkness, holding a role that few people ever knew existed, but many people suffered from. Within our coven, my assignment was known as the Midnight Financial Assassin. My task was not physical harm, not sickness, not accidents, but something far more subtle and devastating. I was trained to attack the finances of Christians during the hours when they were asleep, unaware, and spiritually unguarded. This was not something I stumbled into as an adult or learned accidentally along the way. I was initiated deliberately from the age of 7. My grandmother trained me in these practices. She taught me how to observe people, how to read patterns, how to identify financial weaknesses, and most importantly, how to strike at night when resistance was lowest. By the time I was a teenager, I already understood something most people never consider: that sleep is not just rest, it is vulnerability. In the spirit realm, midnight is not simply a time on the clock, it is a gateway. From around 11:45 at night until roughly 12:30 in the morning, the separation between the physical world and the spiritual world becomes thin. Access increases, authority shifts. Activities that would take weeks to manifest during daylight can begin showing results within hours when released at midnight. That is why our strongest operations were always scheduled during that window. We knew that most Christians were asleep by then. Their pastors were asleep. Their prayer partners were asleep. Their churches were closed. Phones were off. Lights were out. Spiritually, they were alone. To us, they looked like sheep scattered without a shepherd, exposed in a field at night. Each night before midnight, our covenant would gather. Sometimes this gathering was physical, sometimes spiritual, but the purpose was always the same. We reviewed assignments. We discussed targets. We examined who had financial momentum, who had opened businesses, who was close to breakthrough, and who lacked spiritual covering. We kept records. We knew which families never prayed at night, which business owners relied only on hard work, which Christians believed in God did not guard their sleep. At exactly midnight, we would strike. Financial curses were released with precision. We targeted bank accounts, contracts, supply chains, customer flow, promotions, and opportunities. The effects were often immediate. A businessman attacked at midnight might receive bad news about a deal by the next morning. A woman whose finances were cursed might discover unexplained charges or sudden emergencies before noon. Families would face unexpected expenses by evening. What made midnight so terrifying was speed. A curse released during the day might take weeks to show signs. At midnight, it could begin manifesting within hours. Most Christians had no idea this was happening. They went to bed watching television, scrolling through their phones, discussing plans for the next day, and then they slept. The moment their eyes closed, access opened. We had lists of people who were attacked only at night. We knew who had no spiritual defense after dark. But not everyone was the same. Some Christians were different, and those differences disturbed us deeply. There were families we could not touch. There were businesses that resisted every assignment we sent. There were accounts we could not drain, opportunities we could not block, and futures we could not derail. Inside the coven, we called these cases midnight walls. Midnight walls were spiritual barriers that activated automatically at midnight. They were not random, they were not accidental. They were built intentionally by people who prayed specific psalms before sleeping. These walls did not just protect the individual, they expanded outward to cover everything connected to them: their finances, their businesses, their property, their bank accounts, and even their future opportunities were shielded. We studied these cases carefully because we needed to understand why our power failed. What we discovered unsettled us. These walls were not passive, they were aggressive. When we approached them, we were repelled. When we sent curses through them, those curses returned to us with force. Some members of our coven were injured spiritually when rebounding curses struck them instead. The first time I encountered one of these walls personally, it changed everything I thought I knew. I had been assigned to destroy the business of a man who ran a successful pharmacy. A competitor had paid our coven well to collapse his finances. At midnight, I approached his house in the spirit realm, confident as always, But what I saw stopped me. Words were hanging in the air around his property, actual words forming a perimeter like a fence made of fire. These were not symbols or abstract shapes. They were verses from the Bible, specifically from the book of Psalms. When I tried to cross that boundary, the words spoke themselves out loud, and I was thrown backward with force so strong it felt violent. I retreated immediately and reported to my grandmother. She was not surprised. She listened calmly and said something that has never left me. She said, "There are 5 psalms that create permanent midnight barriers when spoken with faith. If a Christian knows these psalms and prays them before sleeping, there is nothing we can do to their finances. Our curses will not manifest, our assignments will fail. We will waste our time and our energy." That night, something shifted inside me. I began to understand that the real battle for finances does not happen during working hours. It happens while people sleep. The Christians we could never touch were not necessarily the smartest, the richest, or the most educated. They were the ones who understood the importance of midnight. In meetings with senior witches from different covens, this truth was confirmed again and again. We would discuss why certain people remained immune despite repeated attacks. One of the most powerful witches in the room, a woman who had practiced for over 60 years, finally said it plainly. She said, "There are Christians whose finances are locked behind walls we cannot penetrate. Every night at midnight, while we send curses, they are building walls. While we attack, they defend. While we speak destruction, they speak blessing. And their words come from a book that carries more authority than all our incantations combined." She was talking about the Bible. She was talking about those Psalms. She was admitting without hesitation that our power could not override Scripture spoken at the right time with genuine faith. That realization haunted me. I had seen too much to deny it. I had watched curses fail repeatedly. I had watched financial traps collapse and reverse. I had seen people we targeted rise instead of fall. And all of it traced back to what they did before they slept. Midnight was our strongest hour, but it was also the hour where our defeat was most complete, when we encountered those who knew how to stand guard over their sleep. After I learned about the existence of midnight walls, my assignment within the coven shifted. No longer was I sent only to destroy finances. I was instructed to observe, analyze, and understand why certain attacks failed. We needed intelligence. We needed patterns. We needed to know what separated those we could break from those we could not touch. I began paying close attention to timing, behavior, and outcomes. What I discovered was unsettling in its simplicity. The people whose finances collapsed were not always careless or sinful. Many of them were hard-working, generous, and sincere believers. What they lacked was nighttime awareness. They treated sleep as neutral territory, unaware that it was actually contested ground. From our perspective, the midnight window was sacred, key to darkness. Between late night and early morning, spiritual authority shifted. Human defenses dropped. Conscious resistance disappeared. That was why our operations during that period were so effective. During the day, people could pray, think, resist, and discern. At night, their minds went quiet. Their bodies went still and access increased. We designed financial attacks to exploit that stillness. We placed snares that did not look like curses in the natural world. They appeared as bad decisions, sudden expenses, delayed payments, failed contracts, or repeated emergencies. The victim rarely suspected a spiritual cause. They blamed luck, the economy, or themselves. We operated systematically. Before midnight, we would identify what kind of financial gate each target had opened. Some people had opened gates through fear and anxiety, others through pride and overconfidence, some through exhaustion, burnout, or unresolved anger. Once we identified the gate, we tailored the attack. For someone anxious about money, we amplified worry until they made reckless choices. For someone confident in their success, we introduced subtle distractions that caused them to overlook details. For business owners, we targeted relationships. For employees, we targeted timing. The goal was always the same: to create leakage, delay, or collapse without drawing attention to the source. What made midnight especially powerful was speed. A curse placed at noon had to push against the activity of the day. People were alert. They talked to others. They noticed inconsistencies. At midnight, everything moved faster. We could plant something and watch it sprout by morning. Contracts would fall apart overnight. Favor would disappear suddenly. Money would begin flowing out with no clear explanation. Many people woke up already behind, already losing, already confused about what had changed while they slept. But again, there were exceptions. Some targets simply refused to break. We would send assignment after assignment, escalating power, adding reinforcements, and still nothing would manifest. When we examined these cases, one detail kept appearing. These people had routines before sleeping. Not elaborate rituals, not complicated practices, but specific words spoken consistently at night. They closed their day intentionally. They did not fall asleep casually. Something was being activated when they spoke those words. One night I was assigned to observe a family we had failed to penetrate multiple times. They were not wealthy, but their finances were stable and steadily improving despite repeated opposition. From the spirit realm, I watched their house as midnight approached. At around 11:50, the father sat up in bed and opened the Bible. He read out loud, quietly but firmly. The mother listened. The children were already asleep. As the clock passed midnight, something formed around the house. It was not dramatic in appearance, but it was solid. It felt like pressure, like resistance. When we approached, our movement slowed, authority shifted. We could not advance. It was as if the space was already occupied by something stronger. Inside the coven, we documented these events. We noted the specific scriptures used. Over time, a pattern became undeniable. There were 5 psalms that consistently produced this effect. When prayed before sleeping, especially during the midnight window, they created layered protection. One psalm hid the person, another assigned guardianship, another sealed emotional access, another released blessing, another provided sustained defense during sleep. Individually, they were powerful. Together, they were devastating to our operations. This knowledge created tension within me. I had spent years perfecting the art of financial destruction. Yet here were people neutralizing it simply by speaking ancient words with faith at night. The power imbalance was undeniable. In meetings, some coven members grew angry, others grew fearful. A few began questioning their own involvement. We had been taught that darkness always had the advantage at night, but these people were turning midnight into their strongest hour. I began to reflect on the Christians we succeeded against. Almost all of them shared one habit. They went to bed mentally exhausted. Their minds were full of worry about bills, plans, and problems. They did not close their day with intention. They did not speak life over their finances before sleeping. That mental state created openings. Anxiety was one of our favorite entry points. When someone slept in fear, their spirit remained restless. That restlessness gave us access to influence dreams, emotions, and decisions the next day. A person who woke up anxious made poorer financial choices. They accepted bad deals. They rushed decisions. They ignored warnings. All of that was by design. In contrast, the people protected by midnight prayer slept differently. Their minds were settled, their spirits were calm. Even if their circumstances were not perfect, their internal state was guarded. That calmness blocked us. We could not amplify fear where peace was already established. We could not create confusion where clarity was declared. We could not steal what was consciously entrusted to divine protection. One particular assignment stays with me. We were sent to drain the finances of a woman who had saved for years. The plan was simple: introduce small emergencies that would slowly bleed her account. The first few attempts failed. Each time we tried to create a leak, something blocked it. Eventually, we observed her routine. Every night before sleeping, she spoke words committing her savings into God's care. She named her account. She named her future plans. In the spirit realm, this created checkpoints. Each potential exit point was guarded. There was nowhere for the money to leak. As I witnessed these patterns repeatedly, the reality became impossible to ignore. Midnight was not inherently owned by darkness. It was claimed by whoever showed up with authority. For years, we had shown up because we believed no one else would. But these people were present, they were awake, they were intentional. And because of that, our advantage disappeared. I began to understand that the real danger to darkness was not loud public prayer or daytime declarations. It was quiet consistency at night. It was someone choosing to guard their sleep, was someone refusing to leave their most vulnerable hours unprotected. That understanding slowly dismantled my confidence in everything I had been trained to do. The more I saw, the more I realized that our successes depended almost entirely on ignorance and delay. When people did nothing, we prevailed. When they acted, we failed. That realization marked the beginning of the end for my work as a midnight financial assassin. I had seen too much evidence. I knew where true authority rested, and I knew that as long as people remained unaware, they would suffer unnecessarily. But the moment awareness met action, the balance shifted completely. As my awareness deepened, my role inside the coven became increasingly dangerous. Knowledge itself is risky in the kingdom of darkness, especially when it begins to change the way you see power. I was no longer just executing assignments. I was noticing weaknesses in our system. I saw how dependent our operations were on secrecy and ignorance. The moment a target understood what was happening and responded intentionally, our influence collapsed. That truth disturbed me because it meant our dominance was fragile. We were not invincible, we were opportunistic. Around this time, the Covenant intensified its focus on Christians who were beginning to wake up spiritually. These were not pastors or public figures. They were ordinary people who had learned to pray at night. We labeled them as disruptors. Our instructions were clear. Increase pressure, escalate attacks, use multip, the entry points at once, the GOA. L was to overwhelm them so that fear would replace discipline. Fear was always the objective. Fear opened doors faster than sin. Fear made people abandon routines. Fear caused inconsistency. If we could scare someone enough, they would stop praying at midnight. And once they stopped, access returned. One night, I participated in an escalation against a man whose business had survived 3 previous attacks. We coordinated a compound operation. Financial pressure, relational tension, and physical exhaustion were released simultaneously. The idea was to drain him emotionally so he would collapse spiritually. As midnight approached, we positioned ourselves confidently, certain that this time he would break. But instead of panic, something unexpected happened. His prayers intensified. He did not pray longer, he prayed sharper. His words carried precision. Each sentence felt deliberate, as if he knew exactly what was coming and had prepared in advance. From the spirit realm, it felt like walking into a fortified zone. The atmosphere was heavy, not with fear, but with authority. When we attempted to release confusion, clarity resisted us. When we attempted to release loss, preservation stood in our way. It was not passive resistance, it was active opposition. One of the spirits with us recoiled and withdrew immediately. Another was struck and weakened. The operation failed completely. What alarmed me most was not just that we failed, but that the man slept peacefully afterward. There was no agitation, no restlessness, no emotional disturbance. That level of peace meant we had no residual influence to exploit the next day. After that night, internal discussions within the coven grew tense. Some members argued that we needed new strategies. Others insisted that we simply needed more power. But a few elders spoke a truth no one wanted to hear. They said our problem was not strength, it was authority. Darkness can exert force, but it cannot override delegated authority when it is actively exercised. Midnight prayers activated delegated authority. That was the difference. We were pushing against something we were not permitted to cross. This led to a disturbing discovery. Many of the financial collapses we took credit for were not solely our doing. They were the result of unguarded minds. We amplified what already existed. We nudged people toward decisions they were already inclined to make. We accelerated outcomes they were already moving toward unconsciously. Our power thrived where discipline was absent. Where discipline existed, our influence shrank. I began observing dreams closely. Dreams were one of our primary tools. At night, we could influence imagery, emotions, and impressions. A fearful dream could alter a person's confidence for days. A dream of loss could plant anxiety that manifested in bad choices. But again, there were people whose dreams we could not touch. Their sleep was sealed. Their dreams were either neutral or instructive, never chaotic. When we tried to interfere, we were blocked. Sometimes the dream environment itself expelled us. That should not have been possible. Yet it happened repeatedly. In one case, I watched as a man dreamed of doors opening instead of closing. Despite our attempts to introduce failure imagery, each time we introduced an obstacle, it dissolved. The dream corrected itself. That was when I understood something critical. Midnight prayers were not only protecting finances, they were programming the subconscious. The mind was being aligned before sleep. That alignment left no room for us to inject fear or confusion. As these realizations accumulated, my confidence eroded. I began questioning why we were taught to fear daylight prayers, but mock nighttime discipline among believers. The truth was obvious now. Nighttime discipline was the real threat. During the day, people were distracted. At night, words went deeper. They bypassed surface resistance and embedded themselves where decisions were formed. That was where financial outcomes were truly shaped. I noticed something else that disturbed me. People who practiced consistent midnight prayers aged differently in the spirit realm. They carried less wear. Their energy was stable. Even when facing challenges, they did not fragment internally. Fragmentation was something we relied on. A divided mind was easy to influence. A settled mind was not. These people were settled. The coven responded by increasing surveillance. We monitored prayer habits. We tracked consistency. We waited for lapses. And when a lapse occurred, we struck immediately. That confirmed our theory. Protection was not accidental. It was maintained. When someone skipped their routine, even once small cracks appeared, not enough for total collapse, but enough for minor leaks. That was our window. But when the routine resumed, the cracks sealed. This taught me something terrifying. Darkness did not win through superiority. It won through persistence and patience, waiting for people to grow tired. The goal was not to overpower faith, but to exhaust it. If we could make prayer feel unnecessary or burdensome, we could regain access. That was why discouragement was such a powerful weapon. Not blatant temptation, but subtle weariness. At this stage, I was no longer fully aligned with my role. I was executing tasks while internally questioning everything. I had seen proof too many times. I knew that the people we could not touch were not special by birth or status. They were disciplined. They were intentional. They showed up at midnight consistently. And because of that, their finances remained intact. The final turning point for me came when I realized something personal. All my years of operating at midnight, all my rituals, all my sacrifices, and yet my own life was unstable. Financially, emotionally, internally, there was no peace. I was enforcing destruction while living in quiet emptiness. Meanwhile, the people we targeted slept peacefully and woke with clarity. That contrast became unbearable. I began to understand that midnight reveals who truly holds authority, not who is loud, not who is feared, but who is consistent. Darkness depends on neglect. Light thrives on discipline. And once that discipline is established, especially at night, the balance of power shifts in ways darkness cannot correct. In the kingdom of darkness, hesitation is visible. Doubt has ascent. Questioning authority creates ripples, and those ripples attract attention. I continued to participate in assignments, but my effectiveness was under scrutiny. Elders began pairing me with observers, spirits whose sole task was to monitor loyalty. They didn't need to ask questions. They watched reactions. They measured obedience. And more than anything, They watched what disturbed me. What disturbed me most was repetition. The same pattern kept appearing over and over again. Whenever we succeeded in collapsing someone's finances, there was always a gap we exploited, a moment of neglect, a season of exhaustion, a break in discipline. But whenever someone maintained consistency at night, our strategies failed, regardless of how sophisticated they were. It didn't matter how many spirits were assigned. It didn't matter how much energy was released. Authority does not multiply by numbers. It responds to alignment. We were taught to believe that darkness ruled the night by default. But I now knew that was a lie reinforced by human silence. Darkness does not own midnight. Midnight is neutral until claimed. Whoever speaks first with authority sets the tone. That realization terrified me because it meant that the entire structure of our operations relied on people doing nothing. Silence was our greatest ally. Fatigue was our second. When people were too tired to pray, too distracted to speak, too discouraged to persist, we moved freely. I began noticing how aggressively we attacked people during TR and scission seasons, promotions, business expansions. Relocations, marriages, and new ventures were prime targets. These seasons required energy, and energy depletion led to nighttime neglect. A person might pray consistently for months, then skip a few nights during a stressful period. Those few nights were enough, not always for total collapse, but enough to introduce instability. Once instability entered, momentum slowed. Once momentum slowed, discouragement followed. That was the cycle inside the coven. This strategy was openly discussed. Wear them down, don't rush destruction, let time do the work. Financial ruin rarely happened overnight unless arrogance or fear created massive openings. Most of the time it was gradual erosion, missed opportunities, slight delays, repeated minor losses. Over time, people internalized failure as normal. They adjusted expectations downward. They stopped dreaming boldly. From our perspective, a person who stopped expecting breakthrough was already defeated. Yet again, there were those who resisted this erosion. They adjusted, but they did not lower their posture. They faced pressure, but they did not abandon routine. Even when exhausted, they spoke before sleeping. Sometimes the prayer was short. Sometimes it was whispered. Sometimes it was imperfect, but it was consistent. That consistency infuriated us because it meant we had no long-term leverage. One night during a high-level gathering, a senior figure addressed a room full of experienced operatives. He said something that shocked even the most hard among us. He said, "Our greatest threat is not faith, but discipline. Faith can fluctuate. Discipline sustains authority even when emotions fail." Midnight discipline was producing believers who did not panic under pressure. Panic was one of our primary tools. Without panic, manipulation was limited. I was assigned to observe a man who had recently suffered a significant financial loss but did not spiral. From our analysis, he should have collapsed emotionally. Instead, he adjusted calmly and continued his nighttime routine. Watching him was unnerving. Loss did not open him. Grief did not unguard him. He acknowledged pain, but he did not surrender ground. That restraint made him untouchable. I began realizing that our obsession with breaking people quickly was misguided. The real battlefield was endurance. Whoever endured longer won. Darkness relied on urgency. Light relied on patience. At midnight, patience was reinforced. People who prayed consistently at night developed a long view. They stopped reacting impulsively. They stopped chasing every opportunity. They waited. Waiting starved us. Impulsive decisions fed us. This internal conflict reached a peak when I was ordered to participate in an operation designed not to steal money but to corrupt motivation. The target was a man who had begun helping others understand nighttime prayer. The instruction was to make him tired of responsibility, introduce distractions, increase obligations, overload his schedule. The goal was to make midnight feel like a burden instead of a privilege. We succeeded partially. He became busier, pressure increased, but instead of abandoning his routine, he adapted it. He prayed earlier. He simplified his words. He involved his family. What was meant to isolate him strengthened his environment. That adaptation was something we had not anticipated. Flexibility combined with discipline was devastating to our strategies. At that point, my internal resistance became obvious. I was no longer celebrating success. I was no longer eager to escalate harm. I was watching, learning, and comparing outcomes. The contrast between our promises and reality was glaring. We promised power, but delivered instability. We promised control, but required constant maintenance. We promised advantage, but collapsed under consistency. I started examining my own nights. I had spent years awake at midnight enforcing destruction. Yet my own sleep was restless. My mind was chaotic. My finances were consistent despite my position. I had access to power, but no peace. That contradiction haunted me. The people we failed against slept deeply. They woke refreshed. They moved with clarity. That was not coincidence. One night during a routine observation, I made a choice that would have been unthinkable years earlier. Instead of participating, I withdrew and watched from a distance. I observed how the atmosphere shifted when prayers were spoken. It was not emotional. It was structural. Something was being ordered. Something was being aligned. Midnight was not being used to fight. It was being used to establish. That was when I understood the deepest truth of all. The people we could not touch were not fighting darkness. They were building light. Darkness reacts. Light establishes. Midnight prayers were not defensive rituals. They were declarations of ownership. Ownership over mind, finances, future, and rest. And ownership, once established consistently, cannot be stolen. From that moment on, my allegiance was fractured beyond repair. I knew the system too well to pretend ignorance. I knew its limits. I knew its dependence on neglect. And I knew that once people understood the importance of guarding their nights, the reach of darkness would continue to shrink. The power we claimed was real, but it was conditional. And conditions can be broken. I had reached a point where continuing meant denying truth I had witnessed repeatedly. Midnight had revealed more than just strategies. It had revealed authority, and it was no longer on the side I served. By the time the final phase of my story unfolded, I was living two lives at once. Outwardly, I still appeared connected to the system I had known since childhood. Inwardly, everything had already collapsed. Once truth becomes clear, pretending becomes exhausting. I could no longer unsee what I had seen or unknow what I had learned. Midnight, which had once been my strongest hour of operation, had become the hour that exposed every lie I had believed about power, control, and authority. The final assignments I participated in felt hollow. The rituals were familiar, the procedures unchanged, but the fear was gone. Fear had always fueled obedience. Without it, the system felt fragile. I noticed how much effort it took to maintain dominance. Constant monitoring, constant enforcement, constant punishment for hesitation. A power that must be constantly defended is not true authority. That realization settled deeply in me. What finally broke everything was not an external event, but an internal comparison I could no longer ignore. I compared outcomes. On one side were people who guarded their nights, who spoke life before sleep, who entrusted their finances and futures intentionally. On the other side were those of us who operated in darkness, restless, unstable, always maintaining, always repairing, always hungry for control, yet never satisfied. The contrast was unbearable. One side had peace even in loss. The other had anxiety even in apparent success. One night at midnight, instead of engaging in any operation, I sat still. No rituals, no commands, no assignments, just silence. For the first time in decades, I was not enforcing destruction during the most active spiritual hour. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. The chaos I had carried for years began to quiet. There was no explosion, no dramatic vision, just clarity. A clarity that felt heavier than fear because it demanded a response. I understood then that my entire life had been built on borrowed time. Everything we did depended on people remaining unaware, undisciplined, and silent. But awareness was spreading, discipline was growing, and silence was being replaced with intentional words spoken at night. The system I had served could not survive that shift. It could delay, distract, and discourage, but it could not override authority that Wu consistently exercised. Walking away was not instant or easy. Darkness does not release without resistance. There were nights of pressure, confusion, and fear, meant to pull me back. But something had changed. The same midnight hour that once empowered destruction now strengthened resolve. I had seen too much proof to return. I knew that the authority behind those psalms was not theoretical, it was active. It worked whether anyone acknowledged it or not. I began rebuilding from nothing. No shortcuts, no hidden advantages, just honesty. And what shocked me most was how quickly stability began to form. Not wealth overnight, not sudden miracles, but order, peace, clarity, direction. The very things I had never possessed despite years of power. My sleep changed, my thoughts settled, my decisions slowed down. That alone transformed outcomes. I share this not to glorify darkness, but to expose its limits. The greatest lie ever sold is that people are powerless at night. Midnight is not a weak hour, it is the most strategic hour of all. Whatever you allow to dominate your thoughts before sleep shapes your decisions after waking. Whatever you speak consistently at night programs your expectations, and expectations govern choices. Choices shape finances. It is that simple and that profound. If there is one truth I want you to understand, it is this. Nothing is stealing from you randomly. Nothing is attacking you without permission. Access is always granted through neglect, fear, or exhaustion. And access can be revoked the moment discipline replaces passivity. You do not need to be perfect. You need to be consistent. You do not need long prayers. You need intentional ones. You do not need to fight darkness. You need to establish light. Guard your nights. Close your day deliberately. Speak life over your mind, your work, your finances, and your future before sleep. Do not leave the most vulnerable hours of your life unprotected. Midnight will either work for you or against you, but it will never be neutral. If this message has opened your eyes, do not ignore it. Apply it. Consistency will do what fear never could. And once you establish authority at midnight, you will discover something darkness never wants you to know. You were never powerless.